Welcome to week 2 of Make, Do, Create and the second week of the Home Film School. Hopefully you've all had a chance to check out week 1 of the Home Film School, as well as checking all the other fantastic workshops that are available as part of this project. Please do make sure that you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because that will mean that you're kept up to date with all of the fantastic workshops that are being delivered and all the other stuff that Wheelworks is putting onto their channel. Thank you to all of you who submitted work last week following the first workshop. I'd like to highlight Maisie's Day, which was sent through, and that was fantastic. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing what work you create this week. At the end there will be a slide with information where to submit it, and I'll also put that in now. So we really want to see what work you create. This week we're going to be dealing with story. Now, as I said last week, it is always all about story. So I'm really excited to be delivering this second section. Stories have always been important to us as humans. We go back to prehistoric times and we see stories that have been drawn on the side of caves. We've shared stories sitting around campfires. The theatre, the cinema, books, paintings, all of these things are about storytelling. We are now at a really exciting time where we have lots of different options of how we tell our stories. And obviously, storytelling lets us use our imagination, tell stories that other people can be drawn into so that we share that experience. Storytelling is trying to make sense and trying to understand the world and doing it in a safe way. Storytelling is about realizing that there are certain things that we all have in common, that bring us together, experiences that we share, feelings that we have, that no matter who we are, we can all relate to. So that is why I am so excited to be delivering workshop 2, which is storytelling. Stories are about everything. They're about winning, they're about losing. They're about hope, they're about fear, they're about friends, they're about family, they're about being lost, being found, they're about life, they're about death. The reason that we love stories so much is that we can watch a character's adventure unfold, and while we're doing that, we are imagining ourselves as that character, working through whatever they are trying to work through. So the first question I want to throw out there is, what is story? Now this might seem really obvious, but it's worth having a look at. We have been brought up on story. So if I give you a few images, let's see if you can guess what story I'm talking about. Let's start breaking down what story is. From last week, we talked about the fact that story has to have a start, a middle, and an end. So it's got that structure. Once upon a time, something happened, someone overcame that or didn't, and they ended up happily ever after or not. So it has to have that structure, and we'll be looking at that throughout this. Secondly, it needs to have a protagonist. Now you might not know the word protagonist, you might know the word hero. It has to have somebody who I'm going to call the protagonist for the rest of this workshop, whose eyes we see the world through. Now that's the really important thing. We are seeing the world through the eyes of a character. Sometimes in film we'll see the world through various characters' eyes, but for the sake of this we will look at story through one character's eyes. So we need structure, we need character. Before we go on, I'm going to ask you a question that will lead us to the third thing that we need in story. I'm going to tell you a story and you can tell me what you think of that story. So we'll begin with a character. Let's say we call her Rose. So Rose wakes up in the morning, she goes down, has breakfast, she goes to school, she sits in class, she has lunch, she does a few more classes in the afternoon. Now, remember that time when we used to go to school. Hopefully it'll be back soon. After school, she goes home, she does her homework, she has dinner, she watches some television, she goes to bed. Is that something that you are going to want to watch? If not, why? What do you think is missing from that story? Because to me, it sounds pretty boring. So, what we need to do with story, once we've got our character, our protagonist, and once we've got a start, middle and end, is we need to add something that really spices our story up. And that thing is conflict. Conflict can be seen as the character wanting to achieve something, but there is something that is stopping our protagonist from getting that thing. If we use the example of Rose, then what if she's worried about a bully at school? Suddenly that spices everything up and we start to get a really interesting story. So we go back to our initial story and we say Rose wakes up in the morning. What happens in that opening scene if when Rose wakes up, her mobile phone beeps next to her and we see that somebody has sent her a really nasty message? Already we start thinking to ourselves, okay, there's something wrong here. There's something that she's afraid of, and that is then going to filter out and that's going to carry on for the rest of the story. So when she's at breakfast, carrying that on, when her mum says, "You seem very quiet this morning," we as the audience, as well as our protagonist Rose, know why she is quiet, and that starts to build interest. What then happens if on the way to school she sees a group of girls in front of her and she tries to avoid them? Again, we're going to know why. We can see that what's called the stakes, the risk, is also increasing. We now have three components to the story. We have the structure, the start, middle and the end. We have the protagonist, the person whose eyes we see the world through. And thirdly, we have conflict. We have something that our protagonist is fighting against. Point 4 with story is called plot. Now we looked at that slightly in the previous example where we heard the different events that we saw Rose in. So we saw her getting up, breakfast, going to school, etc. So all of these events make up the plot. The plot is the different situations that we, as the writer, as the creator, put our protagonist into. Now the important thing is that each of these situations needs to drive our story forward and enable us to see the growth of our character, the changes in our character. To make this really interesting, what we should try to be thinking of doing, that we talked about in the previous example, was we need to try and increase the stakes. Increasingly make it more and more difficult for our protagonist to reach the goal that they're trying to. In doing that, we are really testing our character, and that is what we want to see as an audience watching something. We want to see our protagonist taken to those difficult places and to see how they will react in that situation. The fifth ingredient to story, which is one of my really favourite components, parts of a story, is the location and the setting. It's the world that we create, the world that the protagonist is in at that time. Now, this world can be familiar or unfamiliar to the protagonist. The important thing is that in this world, something different has happened. The fact that something different has happened changes this world for the protagonist. And we see that the journey begins and that a new world is being created as we go through the story. The setting is almost like another character in the story. And the fact that we get to create this brand new world is one of the really exciting parts of story, because you have total control of how this world operates, what happens in this world. Number 6 in what makes story, I have down as the antagonist. So you may think that this is the villain in the piece, the bad guy. But the way that I would describe it is, this is the thing that is pushing against our protagonist. This is where our conflict arises. This is where our barrier is. This is where we create the interest in the story. There needs to be this resistance. And the antagonist is what creates the resistance in our story. I'm sure you can think of many examples of fantastic antagonists in your favourite stories. And in many ways, these are sometimes the most interesting characters in our story. So what we need as the final ingredients to our story is resolution. Resolution is almost like the answer to a question. We begin in one place with our characters and our story, and then we move through that to the end, and at the end something has to have changed. We need to have understood something. The world that we've created and the protagonist that we have put in that world needs to have learnt something, have changed in some way. So we need to think of what the resolution to our story is. The resolution is normally the lesson that we as the audience learn, as well as the lesson that our protagonist learns. How are they different than they were at the very start of our story? We now have the 7 ingredients that are going to make up our story. So the next stage is to find ways of uncovering the stories that we want to tell. I'm going to give you 3 ways in which you can try and discover different stories that you want to tell. They're just ways of igniting that imagination and getting you going. Take one sentence. That sentence is, "I can't believe you." That is said by one of your characters. That's all you've got. And with that, I want you to create the world and fill out the ingredients that you're going to use for your story. Just using, "I can't believe you." There might be a story that springs to mind straight away, but what I want you to do, as with each of these, is think of 5 different stories. Option 2. Find a newspaper or go onto the internet and find a news site and find a headline. Now, I don't want you to read the story. I don't want you to actually find out what happens. But from that headline, I want you to start creating your story. Again, it's going to use those 7 ingredients. And again, I want you to stretch yourself and I want you to think of 5 possible stories. Option 3. You're going to grab the nearest book to you, you're going to open it, and you're going to find the first 3 nouns that are in that book. Once you have those 3 nouns, as with the other 2 options, you're going to write down a potential 5 stories that involve those 3 objects, and that is going to be your story. The reason that I'm asking you to create 5 stories for each of those is that you might have an idea from the onset and you might just run with that. But the great thing about doing that 5 times is that it gives you lots more options, lots more opportunities to uncover stories. The important thing doing this is that you don't midway through stop yourself and say, "This isn't making sense," or "This is silly," or "I don't know where I'm going with it." In each of the 5 cases, really persevere, really see it through to the end and see what stories come up. What might happen is you might have 5 very different stories and you use a bit from one and a bit from the other and a bit from the other. The important thing though is you've given yourself lots of choices. From a blank page, you suddenly have 5 stories that have revealed themselves to you and are waiting for you to make them. Stage 2. Now that we've discovered the option that we're going to use to find our story, we are now going to fill the 7 ingredients to reveal the story further. So what you're going to do is, you know the 7 points that the story needs. You've got your stimulus, what's going to create the idea in your head. So now each of those 7 ingredients are going to be filled out by you. We're going to know where it's set, who our protagonist is. We're going to know the start, the middle and the end. We're going to know the world that this has been created in, our protagonist, the obstacle, and we're going to know our resolution. So you're just going to write this down beside each of the ingredients, each of the 1 to 7 points. Stage 3 is to use all of this information to start writing your story. Now, this can be written in lots of different ways. You might be used to writing it in what's called longhand, just writing out the entire story. What you might want to do is you might want to bullet point it. You might want to say, the day begins with, this happens and it has that impact. You may want to sketch it out. You may want to do drawings for all of the significant things that happen. You could even use last week's exercise, the 10 photographs, and you could actually create a series of photographs that tell the story. The main thing is, this will be your working document, the thing that you would then use to go and start filming your story and creating your film. Congratulations on finishing week 2, and I really look forward to seeing what stories you start to create. As always, there's an email address that you can send all of your work to. I look forward to seeing that and to reviewing that next week. Please remember to subscribe to the Wheelworks YouTube channel. Hit the bell next to the subscribe button, because that will mean that you'll get notifications when new videos are posted, and it will mean that you can keep up to date. I look forward to seeing you next week, and between now and then, make sure you create lots of fantastic, interesting, exciting stories.